So we're going to come back to the question of the labour problem and how it was solved. But what we're going to talk about for a bit now is the Jameson raid. Going back to these tensions between the British and the Boers. So as we mentioned, the Boer governments lacked the capacity to provide solutions to those two labour problems that the firms were dealing with, right? So there was increasing tension between the Boers and the British, and the Boers, those states were independent countries, so there was this kind of diplomatic tensions, and this kind of exploded in this Jameson raid. So what happened is that this British, I think he was a general, let me look. His name was Leander Starr Jameson, actually, and the Jameson Hall at UCT is named after this guy. I don't know why. There's also a statue of Rhodes there, which is I don't know, that shouldn't be there in this day and age. But so what he did is he led a force of soldiers into the Boer republics and tried to convince some of the white workers on the mines, who are like miners but also engineers and managers and all of these kinds of things. He tried to convince them to rebel against the Boer states, because many of them came from all over the world. They were engineers and managers, etc., from Australia, from America, from Europe as well. So they weren't Boers. They were foreigners in a Boer state. And the Jameson led this raid to try and convince that group of people to overthrow the Boer state and take control of it for the British. They were called Uitlanders. Those white workers from other countries, and it failed completely. Like they didn't respond to this call to rebel. They weren't interested. They were there to work and earn money, and they weren't going to die for the. They were just there to work. They're not going to die for the British. So it failed completely. But the diplomatic relations between the Boers and the British then really started to turn downhill, because the Boers saw what they tried to do. They tried to inspire a rebellion inside their country, and they knew it was because of the gold and the mineral resources. And this was a precursor to the Anglo-Boer War, which is a full-scale war which started 4 years after that. Summary. So yeah, the British were agitating for control of the state and of those resources at the end of the day. Jameson raid, and it led. I mean, there's a long history which we're not going to go into, but the basic point is that a war began between these two white populations in southern Africa. Now the British were a huge empire. There was this saying around the sun that the sun never set on the British Empire. They had control of territory in every continent, every part of the world. A huge country, and so they entered this war completely certain that they were going to win. Because at the end of the day, the Boers were farmers. There were a small population of Boers, relatively. They were underarmed. They didn't have many resources. They weren't trained as soldiers. They could all shoot a gun, but they weren't trained soldiers, whereas the British had a huge professional army, full-time soldiers, who had conquered half the world, by this stage. So obviously they thought we're gonna fight these guys out. They thought it would be over quick, and they'd get control of the state, and that's it. So the British went in sure of victory, and it wasn't the case. The Boers actually defeated them, handed them a few very heavy defeats, which made their government very, very unpopular, because they thought, we've sent professional soldiers to fight these farmers, and now these farmers are killing our soldiers. What is this? What is going on? Why are we there? Talk about that a bit now, but also show you some photos. So these are pictures of like some Boer soldiers. Like they're not professional soldiers, small numbers, outdated weapons. There were groups of farmers. Oh, okay, so the next one is taken. You'll see these are guys who were in the class last year, so I put that in there for fun. I don't know if you know any of them.
Small.
Yeah, it's small. Blue. Okay, that's not the point. We like to have fun in the class. If you invite me back, I'll do one for you guys. And it was also the first war. It was also one of the first wars where there were war correspondents, journalists sent into war zones to report on what was going on. Right. So what this meant is that the British population was fully informed of all of these developments of their big, the great British army being defeated by these farmers. And it made that government very, very, very unpopular at the time, and put them under lots of pressure to escalate the war, which they did. Another example of some of that war journalism. This is a photo from the Battle of Spionkop, in which the Boer armies completely destroyed the British force there. And those are the British soldiers who were killed in that battle. And this was hugely embarrassing for this great empire. Right? It was costing lives. It was costing a huge amount of money to have a professional army across the world. And the British public was already they weren't united behind the war, because not all of them. Some of them were workers themselves. They couldn't necessarily see the benefits of going around other countries and taking and stealing from them. So as I said, it made that government very unpopular. So for the first year, I can't remember exactly, but for the first period of the war, the British were embarrassed. They thought they were going to go in and win quickly and get the resources out, and nobody would ask many questions. Then they started to lose, and they had these journalists there reporting it back, and it made the government unpopular. So they thought, we must step it up, end this thing now, which they did, and they did it through a number of tactics. The Boer forces were small groups of farmers, and the way they would survive is that they would go in and strike, and then ride out on their horses and live off the land, live off farms. Would support them along their way, and it was very difficult for this big British army to go and find them in this land which they knew very well, and they had these support from farms and people who were also Boers. I'll come to you just now. So one of the things that the British did to crush the Boers was to begin to destroy all the farms. It's called a scorched earth tactic, where you destroy all the farmlands, you destroy the farms, the houses, you make it so that your enemy cannot live on the land and hide from you in that same way. So this is a Boer farmhouse being torched by British forces in South Africa. And besides having the land that people lived on destroyed and making it hard to get food, the indigenous people were actually, I'll explain this in the next slide. Another one of the British tactics was to put the Boer women and children and elderly people in these camps, concentration camps. These were the first concentration camps, where they take the women, the children, the people who were supporting the fighters on their way, and put them in camps like these, where conditions were incredibly poor, health was terrible, sanitation, food, terrible conditions. And 26,000 Boer women, children, elderly people died in these camps as a result of these conditions. But what's often not even recognized is that almost the same number of indigenous black people were also put in camps like these and died in similar numbers because of the conditions. But you can't even find a photo of that, because for so long that history wasn't even, nobody cared about telling that story. It mostly became about the Afrikaners being oppressed by the Boers, but that part was completely forgotten for a long time. And like I said, so this is one of the Boer concentration camps, and I'll show you some more photos now. For example, these were kind of some of the conditions. They were that bad that this is what the children were looking like. And like as I said, that history is kind of in one side, so you can't even find a photo of what was happening in the black concentration camps. But basically the tactics worked, the scorched earth tactics, and the kind of imprisonment of the wives and the children and the old people kind of convinced the Boers that they couldn't win the war, that they weren't going to be able to pull it off. and so they signed a treaty, the Vereniging Treaty. Can you repeat it?
Vereniging Treaty and the end of the war. Eventually, the Boer leaders agreed to give up. They signed a peace treaty in Vereniging in 1902. The war had lasted 3 years and had cost over 80,000 lives. Almost half of those were made up of black civilians and Boer women and children.
And just to add, that tactic of putting black civilians, people who weren't involved in the war, in the camps, was so that they couldn't choose a side. The British were scared that, okay, well, it wasn't sure which side they were going to choose, but if they had chosen to fight with the Boers, it would have caused the British even more problems. So they thought, let's not even make that a possibility. We'll put them all in these camps, and they died in those kinds of numbers. A completely brutal tactic.
Even though the Boers eventually gave up, the experiences of the Boer leaders and communities in the Anglo-Boer War were a crucial factor in the development of an Afrikaner identity, informed by a unique history of bitter struggle and oppression.
This ensured that Africans would never quietly blend into the British Empire in becoming obedient English-speaking colonial subjects.
And this part I thought it's quite interesting, and we did it with my class as well last year, is that it kind of complicates our idea of the history, because the class last year almost began to, in this particular war, almost began to identify with the Afrikaners who were having the country which they'd taken from other people was then being taken from them, and they were being oppressed as well, which was, it's just something interesting to think about. It's also interesting to think about how these kinds of things, like it says, how these kinds of experiences contribute to forming an identity, identity of who your people are and where they came from and what they've been through.